Last class, hold on. In the last class, we talked about if you have to join between production.product subcategory and the category table in order to get for each product what's their name, what's their subcategory name, and what's the product name, right? So we have to find out for each product what is their subcategory and what is their category. You have to join everything, all these three tables together, because each of the column, the name of the product is in product table, the name of the subcategory is in the subcategory table, and the name of category is in the category table. And if you want to show everything from all the, like columns from each of the tables, you have to do a join, right? And then we have seen how can you join between product to product subcategory and subcategory to category, which can be also seen if you look at the table, which is product table, right? So if you look at the product table, you will see the product table is linked to subcategory and the subcategory link to the category table, right? So if you see in here, the product ID has product subcategory ID, right, which is the foreign keyed in here, but there is no category, right? So you cannot join the product table with both of them, right? Can you join the product table with both of them directly? No, because there is no direct relationship exists between the product and the product category. The relationship exists between product and product subcategory table, right, which is via product subcategory ID. So you join these two. Once you join these two, you see, oh, I know there is a relation between these two tables. There is no direct relationship with the product, but there is a relationship between the subcategory and the category via category ID, right? So what you do is you join this table with the subcategory, and then you get the category ID, and then you join the product category table on the category ID, right? Yes, because you cannot join both of the tables with the both these two tables with the product directly, because the relationship doesn't exist. So you go via relationship. So whenever you have to join product and product category, no matter, you have to go with subcategory. Even though you don't need anything from this table, you have to join product and product category with the via subcategory. So if I ask you, can you give me the product name and the category name? I don't need anything from the subcategory. Do you need to use the table in the joins, the subcategory? Yes, you have to join it, because you cannot directly join product and product category table. So first you join, even though you don't need anything from this table, but it is a link table between these two. So first you join the product with the subcategory, and then product subcategory with the product category table. Does it make sense? So even though the subcategory is of no use for you sometime, but if you have to get something between product and product category, this is a link table in between. So that's what, but in our example, we need everything from all the tables, right? We need one column from all the tables. So we have used all three. But even if you don't need anything and you need to do the column from product category and product table, you have to join on this always, right? Okay. But if there was a direct relationship, then you don't need to, right? Okay. So now let's try to practice the same example that we had in other cases. But before we move on to the other case, let's talk about what kind of relationships are there in the SQL. We're saying that there is a relationship between product and product category, product and product subcategory, and there is a relationship between product subcategory and a product category table. So what kind of relationship would be there between product to product subcategory? What kind of relationship? So there are in SQL, or there are one-to-many relationship, one-to-one relationship, and many-to-many relationship. So we are talking between two tables, if there is one-to-one relationship, or is there one-to-many or many-to-many relationship. So that will help sometime what kind of relationship between the table is. In that way you can get idea about what to do with the joins, right? So if you think about what kind of relationship is between the product out of these three, one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many, if you think about what is the relationship exists between product and product subcategory table, what kind of relationship it will be? So okay, let me give you an example before we see this one. So let's say Or let's talk about this. This is the same case only. So let's say if you have a one product, can one product belong to multiple subcategories? Can one product belong to multiple subcategories? No, it can be only in one subcategory, right? Because there is only one value allowed. So can one product at the same time will be in two subcategories? No, it will be either in on either or in one of the category. It cannot belong to multiple subcategories, right? Okay, but can one subcategory will have multiple product? Under one subcategory, do you gonna have multiple products under one subcategory? Yes, you can have. So it could be that some of the product all share the same subcategory ID. It means one subcategory can have multiple products in it. Yes. Now what do you think? Yes, exactly. It will be one to many because you can have only I mean it's product to subcategory. Product to subcategory is one product can have only one subcategory, but subcategory can have multiple products. So that's why it's one to many. Yes. Yep. Exactly. Okay. Now think about how about between subcategory and a category? It would be the same, right? If you think about subcategory to category, it would be many to one. Yes. Right. Yep. So now what would be a table where you can have one-to-one relationship? So if we look at an example, let's say employee to contact. Let's look at this table, employee to contact. So if you look in here, where is the contact? So employee and person dot contact. Yeah, here it is. So how about employee and contact? What kind of relationship employee with contact would be? So think about what is the employee and contact. So employee can have multiple contacts. One employee can have multiple contact IDs? No. Right? One employee can have multiple contact IDs? No, it cannot, because one employee ID can have only one contact ID. So between employee to contact, there is only one relationship, right? Employee and one employee can have only one contact ID. Can one contact ID will be a multiple employees? No, it's not possible that that one contact can have multiple employees, right? It's not possible. So it's always a one-to-one relationship between employee and contact, right? So when there is one-to-one relationship, it means both of the tables should can have only one ID among the other one. The same the other way is true. So what I'm saying is one employee ID can have only one contact ID and one contact ID can have only one employee ID. So it's direct relationship between these two, employee and the contact, right? It's one-to-one relationship. Now what's the third scenario? Many-to-many relationship. So what could be the case where you can have many-to-many relationship? Let's see in here in the database. If you think about employee, look at this table. You don't have to answer quickly, but if you look at the table how it's designed, employee and the address table, what kind of relationship exists between employee and the address table? So if you see in here, employee is connected to the employee address and employee address is connected to the address table. Okay, so if you think about in here the way this two tables are set up, employee and address table, what kind of relationship it could be? So in here it says the employee ID, one employee can have multiple addresses. Yes, the way it's set up is one employee can have multiple addresses. He would be living in like had like 3 homes or something like that, you know. He can have multiple addresses, right? So one employee can have multiple addresses. So it's, you know, it's one-to-many between employee. Now think about other way. Can two address belong to the same employee? Oh, I mean like, can multiple employees have the same address? So I'm saying that one employee can have multiple address, but one address can belong to multiple employees? Maybe. maybe, yeah, you know, this could happen that if they are living in the same apartment or same place, they could have the same address, two employee, right? Yeah, they live together or something like that. If there is a spouse and you know, like husband and wife and spouse works in the same company, then they can have the same address, right? So what kind of relationship this? It's employee can have multiple addresses and one address can belong to the multiple employees, right? So what kind of relationship it's? Both ways, it's in both ways many to many, right? One employee can have multiple addresses and one address can belong to the multiple employees. So this kind of relationship is many to many. Okay, so you need to think, I mean, how do you know now in here it's many to many? I mean, you won't be able to look directly, you have to look into the data, and once you see, oh, it could be many to many, you know, you won't be able to look directly by looking at here because you don't know. So in the table, if you go and look, okay, I have employee and the address ID, and you look, if one employee ID have multiple address ID and the one address ID belongs to multiple, then it's a many to many relationship. Or the other way is also, if the tables are not directly connected, is employee directly connected to address? No, it has a junction table in between. So whenever you have a many to many relationship, it's always defined by using a junction table. Okay, so whenever you see if these two tables are connected via junction table, so junction table is what? It just has the employee ID and the address ID. That's what it contains. So what it helps is, it reduces the redundancy in the database. So whenever there is a many to many relationship between employee and any two tables, it is handled by having a junction table, okay, or having a middle table. So to reduce the redundancy, we'll talk about that, but it's a very important question. If you have a table that has many to many relationship, how do you handle those kind of things? So you create a junction table and you handle the many to many relationship. Okay, so why do you need a junction table? So the junction table will only contain the primary key from both the tables. So what are the primary key in here? Employee ID. What is the primary key in here? Employee ID. So those are the only two things you have in the table usually. Okay, I mean, these two are just the identifiers, modified when the last record got modified, those kind of things. So these are not the actual record. These are just the columns that are used to identify the records. So you see in here, because you have only two columns, these kind of tables are nothing but the junction table, and that is used to reduce the redundancy that is caused by many to many relationship. Now what is redundancy? So let's take a look at an example. In employee, if they have multiple addresses, okay, and if you think about, if you don't have this table in between, what do you need to do? So if you have a table that has that doesn't, if you have a table that if you have a database that doesn't has this table and it has many to many relationship. So think about, if the employee has multiple address, how you gonna put multiple addresses for one employee? What do you need to do? Because then you need to have address ID in this table, right? If you need to say employee has address ID, where do you gonna put the address ID? In this table, right? You have to put it if you don't have the junction table. Because if I ask you what is the address for this employee, so what you're gonna do? You're gonna put the address in this table, and then you take the address ID for that line and you put it in here, right? Okay, so let's say and just let me open one. There it is, Excel file. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. So think about, if I have a employee table, okay, where I have employee ID and I have all the information about their title and everything, okay, and then I have their address. So if I don't have a junction table, what I need to do? I need to have an address ID in this table. So let's say I have a separate table called address table, in which whenever I add the address 1, line 1, address line 2, and then city and then state, you have all this information in here. Okay, so let's say when you add the person's address 210 North, let's say it's the city is Dallas, okay, all right, and then you put the state and everything, and then you put the street name, okay. So what's the address ID? It will be automatically generated by the database, right? So let's say the address ID for this is 1, okay, and the address ID is 1, and when you have the employee in here, you put the employee ID, let's say starts with 10, and you have the title for that as a manager. Now his address ID is 1, you put the 1 in here, right? So now what do you need to do if this employee ID has 2 different addresses? If this employee has 2 different addresses, let's say this employee ID has another address called 2, and then he has another home in Florida or something, or somewhere, you know, what do you do now? How do you say this guy has 2 addresses in this table? Anyone? So how do you show that? You can show the 1 address because you have the address ID column. Now what do? You don't need to be the exact solution, just tell me what you can do. In SQL, you cannot say 1, 2. In the one cell, you cannot have more than 1 value. It has to be only 1 value. Okay, so SQL doesn't allow more than 1 values. So you can have only 1 value. Either you can create 1 more column in here, right? And you can say address ID second, right? So if the person has address ID 2, you put the 2 in here. I mean, like if the person has another address which is address ID 12, then you put the 12 in here. What if the person has 3 addresses? He has 3 homes. Then you create 1 more column, right? But is that a solution? If the person has 10 address, you're not going to create the 10 address columns. So what would be the other way, right? Because you don't know if the new person coming in, if he has the 11 addresses, you're not going to create the 11th column. I'm just giving an example. They're not going to have 11, but what I'm saying is, if they have 1 or 2 address or 3 address or 4 addresses, you don't know. So you're not going to, based on whenever the new employee comes, you're going to change your database for them, right? So what would be the other solution? Think about it. You can do is, you can just create 1 more row in here and say employee ID 10, manager has another home which is address ID 12. If it is another, then you can just inserting the row, so you don't need to worry about adding the columns. You just keep inserting the row. If the person has 12 address IDs, you just put the 12 rows in the table. So which one would be easier? Either this one or adding the columns. Which one would be easier? So in the database, changing a table is difficult. You cannot change the table because think about, if you have to change the table, your database structure is changing. So that's why you don't go for the first solution, because adding the columns when the new employee comes, it's not feasible, because who does the column change and everything? The database person. And who enters the address and everything? It would be coming from the application. So you cannot do something like that based on, oh, you know, I have the new employee and he has 2 addresses, let me add 1 more column. It doesn't work that way. The database structure doesn't change. Okay, so you do go this way. But when you go this way, think about what you're doing. Just for the address ID, you're repeating the same information. So in the employee table, what kind of information you have? You have these many columns. So for just address ID, you will be repeating all these information over and over, right? For the employee 10, everything is same, only the address ID is changing. So for no reason, what you're doing, repeating all the 10 columns just for address ID, right? Say yes or no. So think about in the employee table, if you have all those 10 columns, I just had 2 columns. But if you have 10 columns, you will be repeating all the 10 columns with the same value just for changing address ID. Right? Grishan, Adan, Victoria. Okay, so now doesn't make sense. Okay. All right. So what I was saying is, let's say if you have a table with many-to-many relationship. Okay. So do you know what the many-to-many relationship is? I will give you an example. Let's say if there is two table, employee and address table. Okay. Can one employee can have multiple addresses? Yes, right. Can one address belong to multiple employees? If you have just one address, can it belongs to multiple employees? Maybe. No, exact same address, exact same address. Maybe. If you have both a spouse working in the same company, then they live in the same house, right? Right. So, what kind of relationship is between the employee and the address table? One employee can have multiple addresses, and one address can belong to multiple employees, right? One address can belong to multiple employees, and one employee can have multiple addresses. So in between the table there is many to many relationship. Okay, because right, because one employee can have multiple address and one address can belong to multiple employees, right? So this kind of relationship is many to many. But if we talk about the relationship between the product and the subcategory, what kind of relationship between product and subcategory? Can product belong to multiple subcategories? So let's say the way you done is the product can only belong to one subcategory. They cannot be into multiple subcategories. You cannot put the bikes or the part of the bike in the clothing and the bike category, right? So the product can belong to only one subcategory. But one subcategory can have multiple products, yes or no? Can one subcategory have multiple products? Yes, right? So that kind of relationship is one to many, right? Because one product can have only one subcategory, but one subcategory can have multiple products, right? So that's one to many, and then this one is many to many relationship. Okay, so now I'm talking about when you have many to many relationship between employee and address. Do you see in here how these two tables are connected via a junction table, which is employee ID and the address ID are mapped in here. So it says the employee ID 1 has this address ID. So it's mapped everything in this table. It's not, you're not doing the address ID, you put it in this table directly, right? Do you see something like that? So in here you had something like this. The product subcategory ID is directly referenced into this table because it was one to many, right? So all they did is they took the subcategory ID and put it in here. Why they didn't do the same thing in here? Why they don't took the address ID and put it in this table? Or why they didn't took the employee ID and put it in here? Because it has many to many relationship. When you have many to many relationship, you do it in a separate table, and that table is called junction table. It's a very important interview question. If you have a many to many relationship between two tables, how do you implement? You're going to implement by using a junction table. Because that's what I'm trying to explain now. Why do you need a junction table? What would be happening if you try to skip the junction table? If you don't have the junction table, what's going to happen? That's what I'm trying to explain in the table. So let's go back to the table. If you don't have the junction table and this person has 3 addresses, you're going to put all 3 in the same table, right? You put the address ID in the employee table, and the employee has just not these 2 columns. How many columns it has? All these columns, right? So when you put the address ID in the table, and if the employee has multiple address IDs, you will be repeating all the informations, right? That's what I'm saying. Do you need to repeat all the information which is same for the employee 10 just for the address ID? So this thing is called nothing but the redundancy. So if the person has 20 different addresses or 5 different addresses, let's say it's a vendor or something, and if it has 20 different addresses, you would be repeating the same information over and over for 20 rows just for different address IDs, right? So the data in here looks like redundant, right? Because you're repeating 10 or 20 different columns just because of the address ID is changing. Everything is same. So is that a good table design? That's not a good table design, because if you have many records in here which are same data and you just changing the address ID, this is the redundancy in the table. That is redundancy in the table. Now think about the other way. If the employee has shares, if the one employee has many address, what would be the other case? One address can belong to multiple employees. What's going to happen? So let's say if all these address IDs are also shared by the another person in the company, okay, because he's a spouse or something, which is employee ID 11. What you do, you just repeating the same 20 rows for the different employee, right? 21, 21, 21, right? Right? So for just what you need to do for mapping the same information, you're doing a redundancy between the table, right? So when you have many-to-many relationship, your table can grow very huge, because all you're trying to do is you're trying to put many-to-many relationship in one table, right? Okay, so that's why when you have a many-to-many relationship in the table, what you do is you create a separate table, okay, that contains the employee ID and the address ID. And what you're going to do is you're going to put the relationship between employee ID and the address ID in this table. Okay, so how do you put it? So what you're going to say is, okay, for employee ID 10, how many addresses do you have? All of these. So you're going to say, okay, for employee ID 10, I have these many addresses. Okay, for employee ID 21, how many addresses do you have? Do you have all these addresses? So you're going to put like this in here. Okay, so are you repeating everything which was there in the employee table? There were like 20 columns. Are you repeating all the 20 columns in here? No, you're just saying the ID that belongs to the address. So see how much redundancy is reduced. You are not repeating all the columns. And in the address table, do you need to do anything? You don't need to put the address ID, and you just need to put this record only one time in here. You don't need to repeat anything, because now there is no more address, so you don't need to repeat the information in the employee table. So see how many records got saved when you moved out this table to a separate junction table. Does it make sense now? So you're trying to do is with if there is a many-to-many relationship between the table, you do a junction table, and which carries all the relationship between the IDs. Okay, any questions? With the same example, let's do one-to-one. Okay, so for the junction table, for the junction table, do you need the one-to-one? For one-to-one, you don't need the junction table. So for one-to-one, what you're going to do is you put the address ID in the same table. You don't need to go into the other table. So either you put the address ID in the employee table, or you put the employee ID in the address table, whichever way you prefer. Okay, so I would prefer to put the employee ID, address ID in the employee table instead of putting the employee ID in here. Okay, all right. I don't want to create an employee ID column. I want to create an address ID column in the employee, because address belongs to employee. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm saying it's because, let's say if I have address for the vendor and I have a separate vendor table, I can put the address for the vendors in there, and then I can put the vendor in the vendor table. I can refer the address ID, right? So I'm trying to put the address table as an address, but wherever I need the address ID, I'm going to refer it for the employee or for the address for the vendor. Okay, so let's see. If the manager ID 10 has the address ID 1, you put the address ID 1. If the manager 21 has the address ID 12, you put the 12 in here. So that's the one-to-one relationship between two tables. Okay, so you don't need to repeat these rows because it's only one-to-one, right? The employee 1 has only one address. Employee 21 has only one address. So it's one-to-one. So that's why you put the address ID in here, and there is no redundancy when you are adding the address ID, because they are not one-to-many. Okay, so either you can do the employee ID in here. Okay, it's okay. You can just say you don't put the address ID column in here. You just put the employee ID in here, and you say employee ID 10 and employee ID 21. Okay, either way it's fine. It's just based on your database design how you want to do it. Okay. Done? Yeah. So now if you have one to many, now think about if you have one to many relationship, it means one address can belong to multiple employees. It's one to many in terms of one address can be shared by multiple employees, but we don't allow employee to have their multiple addresses. Just give us your primary address. What would you do? What I'm saying is, if employee has multiple address, the company doesn't care. Let's put it this way. They just say, give us your primary address. So what kind of relationship exists between employee and the address table? But employee can have, let's say, share the address. You know, if their spouse or they share the apartment, they can have the same address. Company allow that, but they doesn't allow one employee to have multiple addresses. They just keep their primary address. So where do you gonna put the address ID column? Do you gonna put in the employee table, or you gonna put the employee ID in here? Which way would be better? When it's one to many, you're gonna put the address ID column in here, or you're gonna put the employee ID column in here? Which one you would prefer? So let's say, think about this. Employee ID 51 shares the same address as as employee ID 10. They have the same address. These two guys has the same address, which is address ID 1. So would it be convenient to put the address ID in here, or you want to put the employee ID in here? Which one would be better solution? Putting the employee ID in here, or putting the address ID in the employee table? You cannot do both. You have to pick one solution. Which one would you pick? Either adding address ID in this table or putting an employee ID in here. So this one? Why? What if you do the employee ID in here? What's gonna make a difference? The difference would, yes. Yeah, I mean, so but you can do something like this. You can put the you can copy the address, and you say the address ID 1, and then it belongs to multiple employees. You say, okay, it belongs to employee ID 10, and this belongs to employee ID 21, and this belongs to employee ID 51. Is there a problem in this one? Now you did the same thing. All you did is address ID 1 belongs to 10. So address ID 1 belongs to 10. Address ID 12 belongs to 21. Address ID 12 belongs to 21. Address ID 1 again belongs to 51. Address ID 1 again belongs to 51. So what is the problem in this scenario? That's what I'm asking. Which one is better? Either this one or this one? So you're not gonna have both. You're not gonna have the address ID in this table and employee ID in this one. You can only have employee ID in here or address ID in here. So if I pick this solution, the problem is I have to repeat the whole address. If they have multiple columns, I have to repeat the same thing just for different employee IDs. So do you see the redundancy in here? There is a redundancy. I'm repeating the same address. If I have like 10 columns, one address ID, their city, their zip code, their address to, their pin code, their country. So I will be repeating 10 columns for the same address. So if I put the employee ID in here, I'm creating the redundancy in the data. The redundancy is you're gonna have the same address for just two different employees. So I would prefer to do this way, not this way. If I'm a good designer, I won't do this way. I would do this way. I would put the address ID in the employee table to reduce the redundancy. So do you see, is there any redundancy in this table? There is no redundancy because both the employees are different. Only the address ID is same. So all the information in this table, there is the redundancy is just in the address ID in one column. But in here, if there are 10 columns in the address, there is a redundancy in the 10 column. Just one column is different. So I would prefer to skip, not to do this one, but do this solution. Does it make sense? Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes. No, not the number, not the number of columns. The information that you're repeating is, so you're repeating the whole address. That's what you're repeating, right? You're repeating the whole 4 columns. These information you're repeating over here for the employee when they have the same address. But in here, you don't need to repeat anything. You just put the address ID. Okay, because you're going to say in here employee ID 10, and here you're going to say employee ID 51, right? So all the information that you have in these columns are same, only the employee ID is different. So the redundancy is this thing. You're repeating the same data over and over. So let's say if the same address is shared by another employee. So what you're going to do, you have to copy the whole information, the address, and you're going to put, let's say the employee ID 102 is also shared the same address. So do you see, for the same address you're putting in the 3 times in the table. If you would have done in here, you don't need to do anything. You just need to repeat the address ID in front of the person, 102, right? You don't need to repeat the address. You don't need to do anything. You just need to put address once, and you just refer the address ID. Okay, so one-to-one, one-to-many. So you have to decide where you are repeating the same information. What is unique about the table? So the unique about the table is addresses will become unique, and then you're going to put the address ID as a foreign key in here in this table. Okay, so now when you have many-to-many relationship, this becomes very typical, right? You're going to repeat the same information multiple times. You have to repeat the same information about the employee, which you're trying to avoid in here in one-to-many. When the employee can have multiple addresses, that problem would start appearing in here, right? You would be repeating the same manager 10 if it has multiple addresses. If the employee has 21 has multiple addresses, you would be repeating these information, right? So in order to avoid the redundancy in this table as well, what you do is when there is a many-to-many relationship, you just create a separate table. You don't put the employee ID and the address ID in each of this table. You just create a separate table. That's what the solution is. Okay, so see in here, instead of repeating the employee ID 10 multiple times with all the columns, you are just repeating only one column, that is employee ID. You are not repeating the whole columns that are there in the employee table, right? You don't have to repeat whole columns. You just repeat employee ID and you say these are all the addresses. For employee ID 21, these are all the addresses. So you don't have to put the employee ID 21 with all their information multiple times. So think about what are the information in the employee table. In the human resources.employee, if the employee ID 1 has multiple addresses, you would be repeating all these information for the employee multiple times, right? These many columns, right? Okay, so that's why what you do is you put the address ID in the separate table. Okay, so that's why you need to have a junction table, and that's why, because the employee and the address has many-to-many relationship, they created a junction table. That's what the reason is. So the junction table doesn't contain anything other than employee ID and the address ID. These are just the identifier of the rows when the record get modified or those kind of things. Okay, unique identifiers, that's it. So when only there is a many-to-many relationship, that kind of table you will see, which has both the primary key from both the tables is into the separate table. So employee ID is a primary key in here, address ID is primary key in here, and then you put both of them in a separate table, and that's called employee address table. Okay, so it's an important interview question, can be asked when you have many-to-many relationship between two tables. How do you implement it? By introducing a junction table. Okay, any questions? All right, so now let's say what do we do is, if I ask you, can you do help me to write a query in order to find the employee address. Can you do that? What I want you to do is I want you to find what the each employee address is. Okay, what is the employee ID 1 address? What is the employee ID 2 address? You have to find addresses for each of the employees. What would you do? Write a query. What would be your query? Can you join these two tables together? Because you need the employee information and you need the address information. Employee information is in here, address information is in here. Can you join these two tables together directly? How are you going to join it? On which column? Can you match that two columns together? You're going to say on employee ID equals to address ID. Okay, so you have to use only joins. You cannot do the subquery. Yes, the join would not solve it because you need the information from both the tables. So if you do a subquery, you won't be able to get the information from the other table. And you cannot do something like this where employee ID is equals to address ID. You cannot match that. You cannot match something like 10 equals to 1. Can you do that? You cannot do that. If I ask you, can you give me the employee ID 10 address? What you're going to do? You're going to look for the 10 in here and you say, okay, the employee ID address is 10, right? Can you do that? So if I say the address ID 10 in here is, let's say 1014 East Avenue. So you're going to say that what is the address for employee ID 10? Is this the address for employee ID 10? If you say you're going to match on employee ID and the address ID, then you say employee ID address is this. Employee ID 10 address ID is this. For employee ID whatever 21, the address ID will be 21. Is that going to be true? No. So you cannot match these columns. You cannot say employee ID equals to address ID. So how are you going to join these two tables? If you see in here, you don't have the address ID in this table. Do you have the address ID in this table? No. So let's look. Do you have the employee ID in here? You don't have the employee ID. Would you be able to join these two tables together then? If there is no employee ID in here and there is no address ID in here, can you join it? Yes, thank you. Yep, that's what I was looking for. Because you can join, you cannot directly join this, but you can use this table in order to join because employee ID is in here, right? So you join with this, then you get the employee address, employee's address ID, and then you join with this one. So you join with this table on employee ID, and then you say, oh, once I join on this table, I'm gonna get his address ID. Once I know his address ID, then I can join on this one, right? So you're gonna join these two tables on employee ID, and then you're gonna join these two tables on the address ID. Very good. That's what I was trying to take you to. You're going to use the junction table because there is no direct relationship between these two tables. If there is no direct relationship between the two tables, you cannot join it. You have to use the junction table. Now, write the query. I'm going to wait for you. So you need to give me only those addresses that exist in both the table. Don't worry about it. You're going to use the inner join for joining all three. What would be your query? For now, I say select star from. What do I begin with? Tell me the syntax. Right? So I'm gonna say, okay. Yep, so I'm gonna say another table. Which table I put? So I say first human resources dot employee table, and I alias this is E. I put the inner join. What table I take next? Address table or the employee address table or the address table? Which one? Yes, you cannot take the address table. If you take the address table, can you join these two tables? There is no key in here, right? So you have to join these two tables first, right? So you need to pick the employee address now. So you're gonna say inner join, which is person dot employee or human resources dot employee address. Human resources dot employee address table. What you're gonna do to this table? Alias it. Now what do you need to do once you alias? You have to mention joining condition. How do you mention the joining condition? On. Thank you. Now what are you gonna do on which column you're gonna join? Do I have the address ID in this table? So how I'm gonna say address ID from this table equals to address ID from this table? It's not gonna work because you're gonna do it on employee ID. Yes, you cannot do on address ID because the address ID doesn't exist in this table. You can join only on those columns that exist in both the table. The only column that exists in both is employee ID. It has to be same name. You cannot join on employee ID equals to address ID. You can only join on the same type of column. It has to be employee ID to employee ID, address ID to address ID, right? So in here, what is the column you're going to use to join two tables? So what do I say in here? Yes, e dot employee ID is equals to ea dot employee ID. Now you join these two tables together. What did you get? Do you know now what is the employee ID and what is his address ID? Can you tell the employee ID one's address ID? Yes, you can tell. If you go all the way to here, you get employee ID one's address ID is 61, employee ID 2 address ID is 234, right? So now you know for each employee ID what's their address ID. What you're gonna do next? You just need their address. You have their ID. All you need is their address. And where do you have the address? In the address table. So what you're gonna do next? Which join you're gonna use? You're gonna use the inner join, and you're gonna join on which table now? So you're gonna say inner join because you need the third table, right? You still didn't get the address, you just got the ID. So you still have to join one more table in order to get their address. So what are you gonna join? Which table are you gonna join in here? Address table? Yes, address table. So person dot address. What do I do in here for the address table? Alias. Thank you. What do I do? Once I put the alias, I have to join this table with these one, right? How I'm gonna join this table with this one? What is the linkage? Can I join person? Can I join the address table with the employee? Address ID between these two tables. So what I'm gonna do in here, because the address ID exists in both the tables, so I can only join this one. I cannot join this with this because there is no address ID in here. Address ID in here. So I'm gonna join these two tables now. So you already have this first table. You have second table. What you need to do in order to join? You're gonna say for a joining clause. You're gonna say on address ID. What do I say for address ID? Just say address ID a dot address ID equals to ea dot address ID. Thank you. Yes, that's it. EA for employee address. EA dot address ID. Yep. So do you need any information? So let's say you need the employee name. Oh, sorry, you don't need the name. You need the employee information. Let's say you need now. Let's say you don't need everything. So when you run the query, you're gonna get so many columns. Okay. So you don't need all the columns. You see so many columns in here. So let's pick few columns that you need. So let's say if you need from employee table, you need the employee ID. Okay. And you need his manager ID. So you just pick. I'm just picking few random columns and thinking about you need these columns. Okay. So you just say employee title, and then you say employee birth date. So these are the columns you need from the employee table. Okay, and then rest column you need from the address table. So you're gonna say comma, let's say you need all the columns from the EA table. Sorry, from the A table you need all the columns. So you're gonna say A dot star. When you say A dot star, all the columns will show up. Okay, so it's gonna pick all the columns. So see, employee ID 5, his address is this. Employee ID 35, his address is this. Employee ID 288, his address is this. So see, now you're getting employee's address. For all the employees, you're getting the address. Okay, right? So you can see all the information in just one data set. You don't need to go from one to the other. So if you were using a subquery, you cannot pull the column from both the tables together. Can you pull the columns from two tables together at the same time? No. So that's why I was saying you cannot use the subquery, because you can do the subquery, but you cannot display column from both the tables. So that's why the subquery will not help in here. Is it clear? Make sense? Okay, so now see one thing. If I ask you, can you tell me in which state employee ID 5 lives? In which state he lives? Tell me. By looking at the address, tell me employee ID 5 is in which state? Can you tell me by looking at the data? No? Employee ID 5 lives in which state? In which city he lives? The employee ID 5, in which city the employee ID 5 lives? It's an sorry? Watson, right? The city isn't there. If I ask you in which state the employee ID 5 lives, in which state he lives? No, state. The city is Bothell, but what's the state? Yeah, but it's not the name of the state, it's an ID. So do you see, you have the address, but if you want to find his state, which is 79, you have to look in some other table. So let's see, where do you have the name of the state? You have the state province ID, which is 79. So you have to find out what 79 means, which state it is. So let's look at the ERD, and if you look at the address table refers to the state ID, right? Okay, so the state ID is primary key to the state province, which has the province name, state province name. So the state province ID 79, if you want to find out the name, you have to go in this table and look up the name. You see what I'm saying? If I ask you, give me the name of the state province, what you're going to do? You pick the 79 from here, you look up the 79 in this table, and you're going to find the name, right? Or wrong? Okay, true, right? So what I'm going to do is, you want to find the name of the state, right? So what you're going to do, you're going to say select star from person dot state province, where what you're going to say, state province ID is equals to what? You're going to say state province ID is equals to 79. So you run the query, you're going to get the state province ID 79 is in the Washington, it's in US, right? So see, but would it be helpful if you have to give someone this table with the state as well? You're going to give them the ID, because if you give them, so let's say if you give the business people ID, they're going to come back to you and they'll say, what is this? You're just giving me the ID, I don't know what the 79 means. And they not have access to the database. They cannot go and sit for, sit and run the queries like this. Oh, the state, the employee ID 5 is 79. Let's look up the other employee. It's in, everyone is from Washington. No. Let's say the employee ID 4 is in 36. Now I need to know the 36. They're not going to sit and run the query. What you have to do is you have to provide the state name. They don't care about the IDs. The ID is just for the database. All they care about is the actual information. Now what you're gonna do for them so that they can see the state name in here instead of the ID? Look at the, yeah, you link it. How you gonna link these two tables? How you, state province ID, right? So you now need to link these two tables on the state province ID. Perfect, good. So what I need to do in here, I need to put one more join in this one, right? I need to say, because I need the name from this table, I have to include it in the join, right? So do you see the purpose why I need the join another table? Because the name is in the other column and I need in this data set. I don't need it separately. So that's why I have to do inner join on which table? Person dot state province. What do I do next? Alias, thank you. What do I do next? On what's the column you're joining on? State province ID. So tell me the whole thing. What do I do? Put good. sp.state province ID. Okay. What's the table where you have the state province ID? Which table is this? Address. It says address table, so A dot, not address, A dot. No. Which column you gonna join between state province ID? Right, you're gonna join in the state province ID, not the address ID. So from the A table, you have the state province ID. You're gonna join on, right? Yeah. Because this column comes from which table? Yep. So you use the table, but this column comes from which table? From the A, which is address, and this columns come from which table? State province. This column comes from which table? Address. This column comes from which table? ea.add. Yes, alias represents the table. So that's what you do in here. Alias represents the table. Alias represents the table. Okay. That's how you keep linking each of these tables. Now, let's say what you do. You say, I don't want everything from the address table. I want is their address line 1. I don't care about address line 2. I care about their city, and I don't care about the state province ID. I need to get the state name. What do I do to get the state name? From which table I can get the state name? Oh, you do. Yeah, SP you don't have in the A. You just have the ID. Yeah, so you're gonna say SP dot. What's the column name for the state? No, the name from the for the column which has the state name. Name, it's just name. So you're gonna say sp.name, and you can alias this as a state name because the name doesn't make much sense. In the table, it makes sense, but when you put in the data, it's not gonna make sense, the name. So you say state name. Now what else column do you need? Let's say you need the postal code, which is coming from which table? The postal code is coming from the address table. So you're gonna ace a dot postal code. Now run your query, you get everything. Well, let's say you don't get everything yet. Okay, but hold on, we're gonna get it. All right. So if I run the query, let me run both the queries. Oops, I'm gonna run both of them. So see, now I'm getting employee ID 1, his manager, his title, his birth date, his address, his city, his state, his postal code. Right? So now I see the Washington in here, which is much better than 79. Right? Okay. Now if I ask you, can you give me what's the name of the country? Your employee are from different countries. So you don't know, sometime you look at the state, your city, you don't know which country it is. You have to get the country. Do you have the country in here, in this table? Do you have the country in the address? You don't have the country in the address, but you have the country region code. Okay, you put the country region code, but you know what's gonna happen. State province has country region code. That's what the closest you can get. You don't have the name, you don't have anything else in the address table. So let's look at the address table. Does it has a country name? No, it doesn't has the country name. Does the state province has the country name? No, all it has is just closest, which is the country region code. Okay, so now if you have to get the country region code for US, you know it's the US, but let's say if there are employees out of US, what is this DE, what is this AU, what is this FR, what is this GB, what is this CA means? Do you know? I mean, you know, but for some countries you might not know. You know, Canada, it's Great Britain. US, I think it's Denmark, maybe, I don't know. Or this one maybe Australia, I'm guessing, you know. So but how about if the person comes to you then say, you know, this country region code doesn't work for me, I need to know the whole name of the state, whole name of the country. What do? You go look ERD and try to find out where I can get the name of the state. What this table is connected to. Look, this table is connected to what pieces? See the arrows coming and going to the table, and look all the tables. Perfect. The country region has the country region code and it has the name of the country region, right? So what I need to do next in order to get the name of the country region? Yes, I need to join again. What I'm going to join on column? Which column I'm going to join these two tables? Country region code. Perfect. Why do I need to join these two tables? Because I need to get the name of the country, which doesn't exist in here, It only exists in this table. So I know if it exists in this table, I have the key that I can join between these two tables in order to get the name. So let's go in here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to say inner join. What I'm going to say for inner join, which table I'm going to pick? I think it's in person dot, so it's a person dot country region. Okay, so that's how you're going to read person dot country region. Okay, so I'm going to say person dot country region. What do I do to this one? I have to CR. Thank you. Then on which column you go? Okay. Where is the country region code? What's the state province alias? SP. If you put the wrong alias, it would fail. Okay, so now I do this, I get the country region code. All I need to do is put the, instead of country region code, I need what? I need the, what do I do? Instead of country region code, I can say get the name of the country. From which table I'm gonna get the name? Country region. What do I say in here? CR dot name. Okay, if you just put the name, it would be wrong. So you say as country name. If you just put the name, it would be confusing because the name is in two tables. It's in the state province as well, and it's in the CR. So if you just put the name, the SQL will be confused. Oh, I get the name from the state column or from the country region column. You know, so yeah, that's why you have to explicitly define the alias. All right, let's run the query. Perfect. You get all of the information that you needed. You get the address, you get the employee information. So if you go all the way to the end, now you can see what's their state, Canada. What's their country, France, United Kingdom, Germany, Australia. Okay. Yes. Uh-huh. This the same the column the same column name is in two the name column is in two tables, in the state, province, and the country region as well. So let's go and look in here. Do you have the name column in here? Do you have the name column in here? Yes. So the column name can be same in different tables. You cannot have two name columns in this table, but you can have one name column in here and one in here. So the name represents the name of the state, province. The name in here represents the name of the country, region. But when you call just the name in here, you cannot do that because you are referencing both the tables, right? You are referencing the state, province, and you are referencing the country, region as well. So this now you say give me the name column. The SQL is like, from where I'm going to give the name column. Should I give you this name or should I give you the name column from this table? Because it exists in both. The SQL is now confused. It doesn't know from where to pull the name column. So you get an error, ambiguous column name. So you need to explicitly define from which table you are asking the. If it's just one, it's okay. You can just say the name in here. It doesn't matter because you have only one column that is name in the state, province table. So it's fine to call the name in here, but you cannot do it here because since in the from clause you have two tables that contains the same name, same column name. Okay. Yep, good question though, good try everybody. But you see, this is the real time. It's not just you join one table with the other and done. When you're gonna go in the real life scenarios, you're gonna be doing like this. You're gonna be joining one table with the other, that kind of thing. Now think about on top of this, when you try to merge this with subquery, when you try to merge this with group by, when you try to merge this with aggregate functions, when you try to merge this with having, what it's gonna look like, huge giant complex query. Okay. So but for now, you can have multiple joins in one table, and you would be doing that very often. You're gonna have like this because that's how the database is. It has some information in here, some in there. Okay, and so ERDs are always helpful in order to find the information between the tables, the relationship between the tables. And this would be your key to start whenever you get a new database. What do? Look at the ERD. That will help you a lot in order to understand what the data columns are, what kind of information each table has, All right. Come back in here, and that's what we had. The next example we had was, okay, one thing. Now, if you give me everything, now the problem is, can you tell me the name of employee ID 1? I'm asking more. That's it. I know. Can you tell me the name of employee ID 1? What is the name of employee ID 1? What do you do in order to, do you have the name in here? What do I put in the select? Tell me. Okay, let's look at the ERD. Where do I look? In the employee table? Not there. So look what employee table is connected to. So employee table is connected to this guy. It has more connection, but forget about those. Let's say you found this is the connection where you have contact table, person.contact. So what do you need to do in order to get the name? No, come on, you cannot do that now. Join on, which is the key to both of the table. If you have to get the name of the person, contact ID. Thank you. Yes. So now you're gonna join. You get, okay, in the employee I had the contact ID, and in the contact I have the contact ID. So think about this. What is the key that you get in here? So for the contact table, it's the contact ID, right? For the employee, you first find what's their contact ID, and then you say, okay, if the employee ID contact ID is this, I'm gonna look on this contact ID. So you're trying to match the contact ID between the table, not, with this to this. So you say, okay, give me the employee ID 1 contact ID. Let's say you get 1209. You get 1209 employee contact ID. You look 1209 in here, you get the name of the employees. So on which column you're gonna match? You're gonna match on the contact ID. Okay, right? All right. So now let's go back in here. What I need to do? I need to do a inner join on person dot contact, right? I'm gonna give this column as a C. One more thing, you cannot repeat the alias. Let's say if you have given this as a C, you cannot use the C again in here. So one table can only be aliased as, it cannot be alias same name again. Okay, so let's say if you have given the C in here, you cannot C use anymore. Okay, you have to give some different name. The name has to be unique among the table. Otherwise, it would be a confusing state. When you call C, are you calling this table or this table? So that's why each table has to be represented uniquely. Okay. What do I gonna do? I'm gonna say on C dot contact ID equals to E dot contact ID. Not E or E. Yes, right? C dot contact ID, and where does the contact ID exist? In the employee table. What's the alias for employee? E. So you say E dot contact ID, right? All right. What are you gonna say after the employee ID? I'm gonna say C dot. I need the name, which is first name. So I say C dot first name, and I say C dot last name. I just need first name and the last name. I execute the query. I get an error. Okay. So you get now the employee ID name, their manager ID, their title, their birth date, and their address. Okay. Any questions? Okay. If no questions, now can you give me in here, okay, what is the title for employee manager? What is the manager's title? We have done this before. If you have to get the employee's manager title, what is the employee 1 title? Let me first ask you this. Or what is the title for employee ID 2? What is his title? What is his title in the company? Marketing assistant. Who is his manager? Who is manager for employee ID 2? Huh? 6. Manager ID 6. Now if I ask you what is the title of employee ID 2 manager, what is the title of employee ID 2 manager? What's his manager's title? What would you do? Is this correct? So you're going to say, okay, employee ID 2 is manager ID 6. And if you have to look his title, you say, where are you matching on now? You're matching from manager ID to the employee ID, right? You're matching from manager ID to employee ID, right? That's what you're matching on now. And you get the marketing manager. So now if I ask you, can you give me the title for all of the managers, not just for this one, for the 2 you figured out, it's marketing manager. You have to do for all the employees. Get their manager title. What would you do? So for this one, what you're doing, you're joining, basically you are looking up in the same table, right? In order to get the information of his manager, where are you looking? Are you looking in the same table? So this time you have to do a self join. You have to join the same table with itself. Okay, do you understand? Because you're going to look for employee ID to manager, you get the manager ID, and when you look on the same table but in the employee ID, right? So think about this as one more separate table. Okay, think about this as one more separate table. So you get the manager ID in here, and in the second table you're going to match on the employee ID, right? So how can you do it in here? So in here you need to say inner join. Okay, which table you are joining again? With the same table, right? So you're going to say I'm going to join on human resources dot employee table. Okay, think about this one. You already had one, and you're going to put it one more time, and you're going to say this is what you're going to use this as. You're going to use this as a manager table. So you alias this is M. So this is your E table, which is employee, and this is for your manager table. You do on. Now when you do on, what do you get from the employee record? What do you get from the employee record in order to get the manager's title? What do you get from the employee record? His manager ID. So you're going to say E dot manager ID. Okay, you're getting the employee manager. Where are you matching? Where are you matching this manager ID with? With the employee ID. But what's the table? We call this as a manager table, right? You're matching on this table. So you say equals to M dot employee ID. So when you do these kind of join is called as a self join. You're joining the employee table with the employee in order to get the manager's information. So you get the title of employee 2, which is marketing manager. Let's see if we are getting that. So I'm going to say in here title as, from which table I'm going to get the title this time? From the M table, right? So I'm going to say M dot title. Oops, I'm going to say M dot title, right? And which is the manager title, right? As manager title. So now I run the query. I get title for employee ID 2. What was his manager title? Marketing manager. So does it look correct? That's his employee title. That's his manager title. Okay. So see. So what you did in here, in order to get the information from the same table, you do a self join. You're joining the employee table with the employee table in order to get the information. And these kind of join is an inner join, but when it's a self inner join, these are also inner join. Okay, when you join these two, but when you join this with the inner join, right, you're joining E with the M table. E dot manager ID equals to M dot manager ID. So this is self inner join. You're joining the same table itself. And in the ERD, if you look, do you see the arrow is coming in here and going in itself? It represents this table can have an ID, that a self-referenced ID, which is an employee ID, which is referenced as a foreign key in here as a manager ID. So this thing is called as self-referencing. Self-referencing means this employee ID is mentioned in here in this column. Okay. All right. So this is not a new concept for you. We have already seen this when we are doing subquery, when we are doing like aggregate functions and everything. The employee ID has a manager which belongs to the same table. So this, with the ERD perspective, it's a self-referenced, and the employee ID is a primary key, and it's referenced inside the same table on manager ID column, right? So employee ID 6 is mentioned in here as a manager for this guy. Okay. Questions? I know this is little different. The self join is little different than every other join, but you need to know about self-referencing as well. These kind of scenarios would be very less, but very few times you see these kind of scenarios, but you need to know. Yes, that goes within the same table, comes from the same table and goes within the same table. So this is, it means there is a column that is self-referenced within the table. Yep. All right. So now if I ask you, can you give me his manager's name? So you have the employee name. I want to find out his manager name. What you gonna do? What do you need to get in order to get his manager's name? You need to know manager's contact ID. Do you have the manager's contact ID? Yes, you do. It's in the M table. So what you need to do is you just need to get the contact ID for the manager. And where do you have the name? In the person.address. So you need to do one more time join on person.contact, and you say, okay, m.contact ID instead of e, you're going to say m.contact ID equals to cm.contact ID. Okay, so all you need to do is inner join, and you're going to say this table, as this time I'm calling this is for the manager, so I say cm contact for manager. Okay, and then say cm.contact ID is equals to m.contact ID. So now I'm gonna get from person.contact is the name of the manager. Okay, so I say, okay, take the first name and the last name from, I'm gonna move this column in here. Okay, so the employee name, his title, then his manager ID, then his manager name. So his name is coming, manager name is coming from which table? CM. cm.first name, cm.last name. I'm gonna say this as manager name, and I'm gonna say this as manager last name. Okay, so now if I run the query, I'm getting, okay, the employee ID 1, Guy Gilbert, his title is production technician, his manager ID 16, his manager name is Joe Brown, and his manager titles is production supervisor. Employee ID 2, Kevin Brown, his title is marketing assistant, his manager ID is 6, his manager name is David Bradley, his manager title is marketing manager. And then you have the information about the employee, his birth date, his address. Okay, I mean, you can just keep getting the information you need about the employee, keep joining it, you're gonna get the information. All you need to know, the key here is you need to know which table you want to join in order to get the information from where I'm gonna get which column, and I'm gonna join on which column. And this is gonna come by practice. If you think, oh, I can do it, and you know, I understood it today, I'm gonna go after a week and I'm gonna practice this thing, you're gonna forget everything. So go try to practice all these things. Okay, all right, so now let's talk about little bit about the subqueries in here. Okay, so let's say what I want to do is, in one of the classes we have done is, what you need to do is you have to find out how many employees work under the manager. So for right now, just keep this query aside. Okay, what I'm saying is, let's say I have this table, select star from human resources.employee. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to write subquery, and then we're going to join the subquery within this table. All right, so I have this human resources.employee. If I ask you, can you give me how many employees work under this manager? How many employees work under this employee? Can you find out how many employees work under each of them? So how many employees work under each manager? Can you find out? How many employees work under each manager? How would you do that? You have to find out how many employee works under each manager. What would you do? This is just getting the aggregate function and count. That's what you need to do. if you remember, we have done in a previous class. So not previous, I mean like one of the previous classes. So okay, just think about, in this table there are only 10 records. Okay, in this table there are only 10 records. Forget about everything underneath it. Okay, there are only 10 records in this table. If I ask you, can you tell me how many employee works under manager ID 185 or employee ID 185? It's one and the same thing. So how many employees work under manager ID 185? Think about, there are only 10 records in this table. How many employees work under manager ID 185? It's in here, right in front of your eyes. Two. Yeah. How do you know? Yeah. How many employees? Perfect. How many employees work under manager ID 3? And also 2. How many employee works under manager ID 21? 21. 1. What are you doing? In order to get how many employees work under each manager, what are you doing? You are looking in manager ID column and you're counting. For each manager ID you look and you count. So what do I do in order to get that count? What do you do? Group. Yeah. What do I do? Group by what you're creating a buckets? Manager ID. Good. Yes. When you group by manager ID, what do you need to count? You're gonna say, okay, the manager ID in here, right? Which is the manager ID. And what do you gonna do? What you were counting? You were doing count on either the employee ID, or you were counting the star that under this data set how many rows which has employee ID 185, right? So what are you gonna do? You're gonna say just count of star or count of employee IDs, right? Okay, and now this is gonna do on the whole table. We were just thinking about 10 rows, but now we're gonna do this on the whole table, right? So if you do this, you're gonna get each employee has how many, each manager ID has how many employees, right? So 3 has how many employees? 7. 6 has how many employees? 8, right? And this is the CEO of the company who doesn't have any employee. Does this make sense? So this manager ID is nothing but what? This is the employee ID, right? So employee ID 3 handles 7 employee. Employee ID 6 handles 8 employee, right? Can I say that? Tell me if yes or no. Can I say this column as an employee ID? No, why? Yes. Yes. You can say, can you say the employee ID 3 handles 7 employees, employee ID 6 handles 8 employees, manager ID is nothing but what? It's an employee ID. Yeah, you can say. So you can say employee ID 3 handles 7 employees. Number of persons work under the employee ID 3 is 7. Number of persons work under employee ID 6 is 8. Is that correct? So now the information that you get, does this information exist somewhere in the table? I mean, you have found out, but it exists in somewhere. It doesn't exist. The count doesn't exist anywhere in the table, right? It doesn't exist anywhere in these tables, right? That's why you're getting it, because it doesn't exist. So now what do I do is, if I ask you, can you give me for each employee how many, for let's say for each of these employees, how many person work under these employees? Can you give me that? You don't have that information available, but you have that in here. You found out, right? In a separate query. You did, right? So employee ID 3 handles 7. So what you need to do now? So what you need to do, you need to show this column in here. So what do you need to do between these two? Perfect. So yes, you're gonna join on these two columns, because so think about, this is a one table, this is another table, and in order to get this column in here, you need to join on the employee ID. Forget about the subquery and everything. What I'm trying to say is, if you have these two data set, what would you do in order to get this information in here? You join on these two columns and employee ID, and you will automatically get in here. But this time, this is not a table. This is what? This is a subquery. So what you need to do is, you need to join this subquery in your first query. So what you're going to do is, you're going to take this as a subquery. And do you remember last time I told you, all you need to do is you make this as a table. Okay. So what do you need to do for join? You need to say the join name. So you say inner join. Okay. Now, do you want to join on the table? No, you want to join on this, which comes from here. So you're going to take this as is. You're going to put this in here instead of the table name. So you're going to use the whole subquery instead of using the table, right? Because the information comes from the table. What do you need to do next? You need to alias this. What do you going to alias this as? You can say enumber. Okay, enum. What do you do next? Once you alias, you say on. What do you going to say for on? What are you joining on? You're joining on employee ID. So this employee ID comes from which table? Right? And this employee ID comes from which table? Tell me. Enum. All right. Yep. But hold on. Okay, I'm gonna come. So first you say e dot employee ID from e table, right? E dot employee ID from e table, and then the next employee ID comes from which table? From this enum table. So you're gonna say equals to enum dot employee ID. You do that. Now what column do you need to show up in here in your upper query? This column, right? So you take that column name and then you say, you mention it in here. Okay, and you put the comma, and now you run your query. See, boom, there it is. So employee ID 3 has 7 employees. Employee ID 6 has these many employees. Now do you see in here what happened? Do you see the employee ID 1? No, you only see those employee IDs in here who are manager. You are missing those employees who doesn't have any employee underneath them, right? I guess that's what's happening. The employee ID 1 is not there, 2 is not there, directly it's 3, then 6, then 7, then 12, right? So when you did a join, what do you want? Do you want all the records from here, right? Right? Do you want, so think about, you don't have this table. What do you want? So think again as this is not a table, okay? What we had is, let me ask you this in the new query. I'm going to put this one in here and I'm going to bring it back what it was. Hold on. Okay, so did you see the result? What is happening? Employee ID 1, 2, and 3, all those are missing, right? Okay, right or wrong? So if I run this query separately, I get all of the employees in the first table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And underneath it starts with 3, 6, 7. Okay, so which is this table which has all the employees, right? So don't worry about this as a query, just think these two as a table. Okay, I'm asking you a question now. Think these two as a separate table, and this one what you want is, you want all the records from this table. You don't want to do an inner join, because if you do an inner join, you're gonna get only those employees which exists in both the tables. What you want employee ID 1 even if it doesn't exist in this table. What kind of join you're going to do? You want all the employee records from this table. It doesn't matter if it exists in here or not. What you're going to do? You want all left join, because this is the first table, this is the second, so this is left, this is right. So you're going to do a left join. So instead of doing a right inner join in here, you do the left join. When you do the left join, you're going to get all the records from here. So now if you run the query, see, you're getting employee ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, everything. Where you don't have anything, you're going to get the null. So that's the same concept that we learned in here in the sheet 1. If you have a left table and you have a right table, you need everything from the left table. You do a left outer join, and if it doesn't exist, you get the null. The same thing you're doing. So that's what it is. So you do a subquery, you're using the aggregate function, you're using the group by, and you do a left join instead of inner join because you want to get everything. Yes, questions now. Thanks for the patience, Victoria. Yes. You get the same column, but when you do the left, all you get is you get all the employees from the left table. Which is your left table? This is your left table. So you get all the employees from the left table. It doesn't matter the employee exists in here or not. So its only thing is you're including 1, 2 as well. 1, 2, you're getting all of them. You're just not getting which exists in this table. Because employee ID 1 is not a manager, he doesn't have any employee underneath him, so that's why it's not in here. Because employee 1 is not a manager, so you don't get it in here because he doesn't have any person who work under him. So that's why you don't get it in here. So what you wanted to do is you want to show all the employees, even though if they don't have any person working under them, you show it as a null. So 1, he doesn't have any employee under him. 2, he doesn't have any employee. 3, he does. So that's why you do a left join, because you wanted all the records from the left table. You don't want the inner join. If you do the inner join between these two tables, you're going to get only those employee ID which exist in both the tables. Make sense? Yes, Victoria. I know you were saying about this table, what I have in here had the manager ID. How did it become the employee ID, right? So the manager ID is he is to the company. Let's say if you say we work in the same company, Adan, you, me, and Glishan. Okay, I say Victoria is my manager, but what you are to the company, you are employee to the company, right? So even though I'm saying you are my manager, but you are employee to the company. So the same thing, employee ID is 1, his manager ID is 16, but both are employee to the company. So that's why this 16 is nothing but what? It's an employee ID. So I'm saying that in here, employee ID 3, he holds 7 persons underneath him. So that's why I change employee ID to manager ID, because this definition is nothing but an employee ID. Right? Okay, let me tell you this. Let's say this is my employee ID, okay? And that's that's you. So who is my manager? Victoria. What's your employee ID, Victoria? 16. So what I'm gonna put it in my record. I'm gonna say my manager is 16, which is nothing but you. Right? So your employee ID becomes my manager ID. So that's what I'm doing in here. When I convert this manager ID to the employee ID, because I'm saying manager ID 3 holds 7 person, but it's nothing but he is an employee. So this employee holds 7 person. This employee holds 8 person. This employee holds 6 person underneath him. Does it make sense now? Okay, so that's all I did the employee ID, because I want to join in here. I mean, I can keep it as a manager ID and then I will join, but then it would become confusing in here. So just to make it simpler, I alias the column. So do you believe, can you write this? I mean, like, you are to the point where you can write like complex queries. Anything you think about in the database, you can write queries on that. All it just need is the practice and practice. All right, anyone, any questions? If not, we can end in here. Thank you. Good night.